For 3 weeks, Nathan Gunther's goats were trying to tell him something. He just didn't speak their language yet. Keep reading what they were warning him about had been buried for over 20 years. Nathan had run his small goat farm in rural Oklahoma for nearly 15 years. 40 goats, predictable as clockwork, grazing and playing and following their routines with the kind of quiet reliability that made early mornings worth getting up for. He knew every one of them by name. He knew which ones were stubborn, which ones were gentle, which ones would follow him to the barn door just for the company. That's why Tuesday morning stopped him cold. A cluster of goats had gathered near the far edge of the western pasture, a scrubby, rarely used corner where poor soil kept everything stunted, including a small oak that had never managed to grow taller than 8 feet in all the years Nathan had owned the land. He assumed they were scratching themselves against the bark. Goats did that sometimes, especially in late summer when their coats thickened. He got closer and realized they weren't scratching. They were ramming. One after another, heads lowered, legs driving hard into the dirt, charging the trunk with enough force to send a dull, hollow thud echoing across the open field. Nathan shooed them away and walked up to the tree. The bark was shredded in places, fresh gouges from horns cut deep into the wood. He checked the animals and found small cuts bleeding on several foreheads. Whatever this was, they were hurting themselves to do it. He stood in the field for a long moment, looking at the damaged tree and then back at his goats, who had already begun drifting toward the oak again the moment his back was turned. Something was wrong. He just didn't know what yet. That evening, Nathan told his wife Carol over dinner. She listened carefully and suggested minerals. Goats were notorious for seeking out salt deposits and trace elements in soil, and they could be almost violently persistent when something triggered that instinct. The theory was reasonable. Nathan went to bed half convinced. He was wrong before breakfast. The next morning, the goats were back, hitting harder than before. 2 had blood running openly down their faces. Nathan separated the injured animals, cleaned and treated their wounds, and locked them in the barn with a latch he was confident about. By afternoon, they had broken out and returned to the oak. He stood at the fence line, staring at them. These animals he had raised from kids, these creatures he knew as well as he knew his own hands, and felt something he hadn't felt in 15 years of farming. Unease. Real, settled, uncomfortable unease. He spent the entire next day building a reinforced barrier. Steel posts driven deep into the earth, heavy gauge wire stretched tight between them. The kind of fencing that didn't bend under pressure. He tested every joint, every anchor point. He walked the perimeter twice. He went to bed that night with the quiet confidence of a man who has solved a problem with his hands. He woke up to find it destroyed. Posts bent at strange angles. Wire torn and scattered across the grass like something had hit it from both sides simultaneously. The goats stood at the tree in the early morning light, still at it, foreheads bloodied, completely undeterred. Carol watched from the porch, her face pale. She didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. Nathan called his neighbor, Harold Benson. Harold had farmed this county for over 40 years and had the particular confidence of a man who believed there was nothing left on this earth capable of surprising him. He arrived within the hour, walked the perimeter of the oak slowly and methodically, got down on his hands and knees to examine the soil, pressed his nose close to the bark, studied the branches, the leaves, the root line. 20 minutes of silence. Then he stood up, brushed the dirt from his knees, and said, "Call a vet." Dr. Elena Vasquez drove out the following morning with her equipment loaded in the back of her truck. She was thorough and unhurried, the kind of professional who treated every case like it deserved her full attention. She spent hours with the herd, drew blood from 6 animals, checked eyes, ears, neurological responses, screened for parasites, infection, toxic ingestion, and a half-dozen other possibilities Nathan couldn't have named. When she finished, she washed her hands, leaned against her truck, and gave him her verdict. The goats were perfectly healthy. No infection, no toxins, no neurological damage, no medical explanation whatsoever for what they were doing. Whatever was driving 40 goats to destroy themselves against a stunted oak tree in a forgotten corner of an Oklahoma pasture, It wasn't coming from inside their bodies. That left only one possibility. Nathan made a decision. If the tree was the problem, the tree had to go. He drove into town and rented an industrial chain, the heaviest grade available, rated for several tons of pulling force. He attached one end around the base of the trunk and the other to the hitch of his tractor. Carol stood at a distance, arms folded. Harold had come back. He said he just wanted to see how it turned out, but Nathan suspected he was as unsettled as the rest of them. Nathan climbed into the cab, started the engine, slowly increased the throttle. The chain pulled tight with a low metallic groan. The tractor's tires bit into the earth. The oak resisted for a moment, and then Nathan heard the roots begin to tear. That distinctive sound of soil being forced to give up something it had held for a long time. Then came the other sound. A shriek. Metallic, sharp, completely wrong, rising from beneath the ground like something had been punctured. Not a natural sound. Not a root sound. Something manufactured and hollow, reverberating up through 20 years of packed earth. Nathan cut the engine. Silence fell over the field. He climbed down slowly. The oak was on its side now, roots exposed and pointing skyward. A ragged hole had opened in the earth where the base had been. Nathan approached it carefully, knelt at the edge, and began brushing loose soil away with his hands. Metal, rusted and dark and unmistakably solid. The roots had wrapped themselves around a surface, grown through a gap in what appeared to be a roof, and burrowed down into whatever was below. Nathan leaned closer to look into the gap. The smell reached him before his eyes could adjust. Chemical, acrid, sharp. In a way that had nothing to do with nature, the smell of something synthesized. Something that had no business being in the ground beneath an Oklahoma farm. His eyes began to water immediately. His throat constricted. He lurched backward onto the grass, coughing, one hand pressed over his nose and mouth. Carol was calling his name from across the field. He sat in the grass for a moment, heart slamming, staring at the hole. Then he pulled out his phone and dialed 911 with shaking hands. "I found something buried on my property," he told the dispatcher. "Something that smells dangerous. Something that doesn't belong here." 2 deputies arrived within 30 minutes. They approached the hole with the measured calm of men who had handled rural calls for years and expected to find a dead animal or a leaking propane tank. They got within 10 feet, caught the chemical smell rising from the earth, and immediately stepped back. One of them was already on his radio before Nathan finished explaining. By evening, the western pasture had been transformed. Yellow tape in a wide perimeter. Portable floodlights running on generators. A team of hazmat specialists in full protective suits working methodically around the uprooted tree. Nathan, Carol, and Harold watched from behind the barrier and said very little. The excavation took 3 full days. What came out of the ground was a full-size industrial shipping container, the kind used to move freight across oceans. It had been buried deliberately, at least 2 decades ago, possibly longer. The earth had compacted over it perfectly, and the oak tree had grown directly above it, its roots eventually finding the gaps in the corroded roof and threading themselves down through the darkness inside. The container held the remnants of an illegal drug manufacturing operation. Cooking equipment. Chemical drums. Residue from substances that required specialized handling even in controlled laboratory conditions. Whoever had run the operation had made a calculated decision: bury the entire lab, let the earth swallow it, and walk away clean. What they hadn't calculated was chemistry. The volatile compounds sealed inside the container hadn't simply stopped reacting. They had continued off-gassing for 20 years, slowly, steadily, building pressure against a corroding metal shell. When the oak's roots cracked the roof open, the fumes found their path upward, through the roots, through the soil, rising invisibly through the grass of Nathan's western pasture. The goats had smelled it long before any human instrument detected it. More than smelled it, felt it. Their skin, their airways. Their extraordinarily sensitive nervous systems had been registering the chemical irritation. Every time they grazed near that corner of the field, the ramming, the frenzy, the absolute refusal to be deterred, it hadn't been madness. It had been an alarm. The only alarm they had? Hazmat teams worked the site for nearly 2 weeks, carefully neutralizing the contamination and preventing chemical leachate into the groundwater that supplied several neighboring farms. The container was eventually cut apart, removed in sections, and disposed of at a specialized facility 3 states away. Nathan's goats returned to normal within days of the container's removal. The cuts on their foreheads healed. The frenzy disappeared completely. They went back to grazing in the morning light, following their routines, calm and unhurried, as if the previous 3 weeks had never happened, as if the alarm had simply been switched off. Now that someone had finally listened, authorities launched an investigation. But the trail had gone cold long before they started looking. The people responsible had moved on or died, leaving behind a buried secret that had been quietly poisoning the ground above it for 2 decades. Nathan filled in the excavation, planted new grass over the bare earth. The stunted oak was gone. The corner of the western pasture looked like nothing had ever happened there. But Nathan never forgot. In 15 years of farming, he had learned to read his animals, their moods, their habits, the small signals that told him when something was off. He thought he had known them completely, what the goats had taught him. In 3 weeks of bloodied foreheads and broken fences and relentless, desperate persistence, was that he had only understood the surface of them beneath that, in whatever wordless interior those 40 animals carried. With them through their days, there was something older and sharper and more faithful than language. They had known something was wrong beneath his feet, and they had never stopped trying to tell him. Sometimes the most important warnings come from the ones who can't use words. Share this with someone who underestimates animals. They might need to hear it.